Greetings, friends. Greetings from Jerusalem. Greetings from Sabil. I hope everyone is doing well. It seems a number of people have been calling us that they're having problems logging into the email, into the meeting. So if you give, so we'd appreciate your patience as we try to help people get in. So in the meanwhile, I hope you've had a wonderful, or you're having a wonderful week. Or if there's new people who are attending, my name is Omar Harami. I work at Sabil, and I have the privilege of interviewing or introducing or guiding the discussion every week with wonderful speakers for Sabil. So today we have a wonderful friend. Many of you already have met Sahar. Sahar is with us. Sahar, can we check that everything is working with you?
Let's hope so. Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you.
Perfect.
It was me and Sahar, we've met, we know each other for some time, but the last time we've met was before COVID. I don't think we've met after COVID.
True.
Yeah, true. A lot of things changed since COVID. A lot of things. I hope you did not change, Sahar. You're still an amazing person.
I've completely changed sides, and now I'm going to tell you. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, it is. It's Sahar, you've been so the tradition in Sabil updates and Kumi meetings is that the speaker introduces herself. But before you introduce yourself, I'd like just a little bit of a checkup. You were studying abroad during these past years, and now you're back to Israel?
Yes. So for the last year and a half, more or less, I've been mostly in the UK doing a master's in peace studies, but I just came back about a month ago after finishing. So I'm back in Jerusalem.
Yeah, I mean, the UK is an authority in creating conflicts this weekend.
Yes, very much so.
It's good that they're switching their interest into peace building. So Sahar, many of you already have met Sahar. She spoke in multiple Sabil conferences, and she spoke to various Sabil groups in the country, but also she's been present and she attended and visited multiple countries. I mean, recently the UK, but many places where she has spoken about Palestine, Israel. So can you please briefly introduce yourself, Sahar? But before you introduce yourself, I have to say that it is many people know Sahar, but it's actually the most famous person who introduced us to Sahar is her father. Her father is a dedicated peace activist. I met him the first time it's just after the second Intifada. A very dedicated and stubborn activist. What are doing? Is he okay?
He's doing fine. Yeah, he's just retired this year, which just means that he's has more time for activism, which I think is it's going to be an interesting year for him to see how much he can do.
I mean, these Sabil Kumi meetings are more like, most of us are a group of friends, or all of us, and we're connected to Sabil and so on. So we know most of the people, and I see still people are joining in. But why don't we start? Just a reminder that this session is being recorded, and it is also being broadcasted on Facebook. Actually, it is not. I'm going to do it because a number of our followers follow us on Facebook. They don't like Zoom as much as we do. So Sahar, please do introduce yourself.
So for those of you who I haven't had the pleasure to meet here or there, so I'm Sahar. I'm from Jerusalem, born and raised. And over the past, 20 years now, almost, I've been active in different kinds of activist groups against the occupation. So I started very much with Tayush and work in the South Hebron Hills. And later on with the protests against the wall as they were happening around 2004, 2005 onwards in places like Bil'ain and places of the sort. I then refused my military service, so I'm also a conscientious objector, spent a couple months in prison in that process, and kind of went back into activism since then, mostly in Jerusalem, for those of you who know Sheikh Jarrah and the struggle there, as well as other places. In more recent years, I was working for the Quakers for about a decade before I went to study, mostly on militarization. So I've been doing a lot of research on Israeli arms export, where Israeli exports arm, the human rights violations that are involved in that. So also a bit of a kind of global militarized view. And as Omar said before, I last year and a half, I've been away for a bit. So just before that, actually, I did a few months of an accompaniment project in Musafariyata in the South Hebron Hills. So I was living there for about 4 months during COVID. And then after that, went to study, and I'm kind of just coming back from that back into activism here. So that's a bit about myself.
And I don't know if you know, Sahar, while you were away, actually, we got Smotrich and Ben Gavir in the government. They smuggled into the government. Yeah, and it's the peace deteriorated inside Israel. So can you give us an update on, I mean, it's how the new Israeli government is doing? And I mean, maybe it is a little bit to reflect the discussions that are happening inside Israel, and also what's the conditions with the demonstrations in the streets.
Definitely. There's a lot to say about this new government. And I'll say that some of it is the things that we're talking about more, seeing more with the protests on the streets, but there's also a lot that's happening and changing that isn't talked about as much. And I think we need to, give a bit of space for both those things. From a very early stage, this government is relatively the most stable we've had in a few years, at least as far as numbers go, right? They had a majority of 65, which doesn't sound like that much in 120, but is much more than we've seen in previous government, which also meant that they knew that they were coming into a government with the ability to do a bit more than previous governments did, or that they're a bit more stable in that. And a lot of different things happen with that, but part of it is to say that at least at the very beginning of this new government, there was a government with it's an entirely right-wing government, but within the government, actually Netanyahu comes from a relatively not a very stable place, and that has to do with the fact that there's not a single party in government right now that he can do without for a coalition, which means that he is very dependent on them and needs to to always have everybody's support. And we saw that as early as the negotiations for the government and the coalition agreements that had rather significant demands by a lot of the kind of more extreme right wing that were answered. And there's a few different examples of that, but one of the ones that I think is very important for us and was talked about a lot before the protest, but I feel like the protest kind of took the space from it, is the fact that not only is our Minister of Police, Minister of Foreign Interior Security, is a convicted terrorist, an extreme right-wing Ben Gvir, which I think has made a bit of the headlines, and a lot of governments were very opposed to, but also within the Ministry of Defense, you have not the Minister of Defense, but the ministry within the Ministry of Defense that Smotrich is holding, which gives him the civil administration, which in effect, it's very interesting because it's the first time we've seen the civil administration being detached from the rest of the military, from the rest of the Ministry of Defense. And in effect, it also means that there's a direct ministerial supervision on the civil administration. This sounds extremely technical, what I just said, but it is important in the sense that legally speaking, in a way, it means that the military is no longer going to be directly implementing the civil administration, but rather it'll be the ministry, therefore the government, therefore as far as occupation laws are concerned. And we know that Israel is in breach of many occupation laws, but as far as occupation laws are concerned, that is kind of annexation de facto. And I think that that's a conversation we need to have. And I don't know how many of you are following, but there is a conversation within International Court of Justice about is what is the occupation already annexation and therefore illegal also on that level? And I think that this is another interesting shift that's happened. So that's one thing we could be talking about. But back to the things that have kind of taken more the headlines has really been what people are calling either the judicial reform or revolution, or however you want to talk about it, which are currently a set of 140 bills. Many of them are duplicates, so probably less than half of that are actual bills. But what they suggest in very general terms is decreasing significantly the judiciary supervision of the government. And part of that is decreasing the strength, the ability of the Supreme Court, for instance, to overrule laws and allowing the government to override any kind of cancellation of laws by the Supreme Court. Another aspect of that is moving most of the legal advisor positions of the different ministries, of different positions, shifting them away from being a professional position that gives legal advice and says, well, you can't do this, into what's called trust positions. I don't know if that translates, but what it means is that any minister who will come in will be appointing his own people, and it's becoming kind of more of a legal advisor, a bit like in the corporate world. It's a lawyer whose job is to tell you how you can do this legally, rather than to tell you, is this legal or not, right? So kind of a different position. So that's another significant change.
But maybe if we can go by
yes.
change, because a lot of things are happening. And many of it is very complicated. So most people, especially Americans, but most people living in democratic countries, when they think about like the Supreme Court, it means Supreme Court. It's like highest authority when it's creating. It's the highest place where you go and you seek justice. I've had the experience going to the Israeli Supreme Court multiple times, and you feel it's at least, it's not that I was granted justice, or the people that I was with, we were granted justice, but in a way you feel that it's the highest authority is the law and justice, and in a way it's beautiful if the system works. But what's the logic of making government officials or individuals more powerful than the Supreme Court? How are they justifying it to the Israeli society?
Well, I mean, the logic, and again, this is the kind of the internal discourse there, is saying, well, the Supreme Court is one body out of three. It's a non-elected body, right? It's probably the least, of the three authorities of parliament, the government, and the judicial system, it's the least representative. And therefore, it shouldn't have the right to overwrite laws that are coming from parliament, that is theoretically the representative body. That's the argument. Now, if we look
and
at
Israel
kind of
doesn't
theory,
have a constitution, correct?
Right. I mean, we don't have a constitution, but in effect, the Supreme Court acts as a constitutional court, right? Without a constitution, it still acts as a constitutional court based, as you said, on these concepts of basic laws, what we have. And it's interesting because also this conversation has brought up again the question of, well, maybe we should have a constitution, or at least from the kind of more liberal side of Israeli politics. So that's the logic around that. And again, I think it is important to say this is part of a very deep political divide within Israel. Israel is coming out of 5 years of not being able.
But I mean, I just want to add, for most people, like at least in many parts of the Arab world, or many parts of where countries do not have dictatorships or had democratic elections, and they elected dictators, and that's, I mean, in a way, it's very dangerous, because sometimes democracy would lead to a dictator or people in power who are not completely in line with democratic values. So they use democracy just to get into power, and they take over the system, and just saying we came through democratic pulse, and that's why it's no longer needed.
Yeah, so, and I don't know how it is in other places, but at least here in civics class in the 8th grade, you study the kind of concept of division of the different authorities, and exactly about that, about the fact that they can balance each other. And again, in our civics book, when we talk about it when we're 14 or whatever, the example that's given on how a democratic country can, or how someone can be democratically elected and not be democratic, is Hitler. Like it's a pretty dramatic example that we're given there. Now, historically speaking, it's a bit more complicated, and it's not, he didn't actually have a majority, but that's not the point. The point is that is exactly the kind of places where you say, what, again, I'm not sure I'll be using the right terms in English because I'm kind of translating as I go, but what we call a defensive democracy, or a democracy that can protect itself in order to remain a democracy. And those are a lot of those kind of thresholds that are in place, and the Supreme Court is seen as one of them. But again, if you ask what is the discourse of the justification, that's the discourse of the justification. But I think it's important to say that's only the legalistic discourse of the justification. And the other discourse of the justification, and this comes to the rift which Israeli society is in, is a simple one that says there is an elite in this country, a liberal elite, that is not the majority in governments and has not been the majority in governments for a while, but continues to hold a lot of power, which is true. It continues to hold a lot of power, and the Supreme Court is one maybe manifestation of that, which I think we can argue quite a lot. The Supreme Court has also become much less liberal than it used to be. And I'm using liberal rather than right and left here because I think it's much more accurate. It's not exactly, it's definitely not a left-wing Supreme Court. It's not a left-wing elite at all, but it is a liberal one. And I'll speak a bit to what I mean by that. Yes, please.
So when we use like the topic of, for example, when we say that the Supreme Court is liberal on social issues inside Israel, or liberal on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict with division?
I think this is why I'm using liberal as opposed to left. Because it's liberal in the sense of if you talk about, and yes, definitely within Israel, but even within Israel, that's its limitations. I think, I don't remember which, some international constitutional scholar said that when he visited Israel, his comment on the Supreme Court was that it was one of the most progressive Supreme Courts he's ever seen until the Green Line. And I think that on some things, that's very true. It was until about 10 years ago, it was a pretty liberal, pretty progressive Supreme Court that held certain forms of human rights pretty high up until the Green Line. Very
But does
clearly.
This also apply to Israeli Arabs, or only like Jewish democracy?
So historically, a bit more. As far as Supreme Court rulings go, it doesn't mean that this was implemented. But even if we look at cases like Ikrit and Beram, which are Palestinian villages up north that were displaced in 48, but because their residents remained within Israel, are citizens and could claim that back, the Supreme Court accepted their claims, didn't implement it, didn't allow it to be implemented, and no government allowed it to be implemented. But as far as, so again, this is far from being perfect, and the realities of Palestinian citizens of Israel are very far from equality. But as far as the Supreme Court is concerned, again, relatively pretty liberal, but there's a scale there. Not on Palestinians within the West Bank and Gaza for sure, less on other Palestinians, and also less on other groups. Like it's definitely not perfect, but it is far more liberal.
But I want to, sorry, Sahar, I can continue to interrupt you.
Please.
So for people who are listening here, so with Biram, the Palestinians, I mean, it's Biram is the village of Kufr Biram, is one of the completely Christian villages that got depopulated in 1948. And many of the residents of these villages lived in, continued to live inside Israel, what became Israel. And they approached the Israeli High Court, and the Israeli High Court said, yes, they should go back home. But nothing was implemented. Like if it's somebody goes and there's a decision, so like the High Court gives an opinion, but not a decision inside Israel.
So theoretically, it gives a decision. and it needs to be implemented. But
Yeah.
this is where the government will come and say, well, we can't implement it because A, B, C. And
So
the Supreme
Israel was
Court,
already overwriting, the governments were already overwriting decisions of.
yes, but much more in agreement. So the Supreme Court then
Yes.
has the decision, do you hold them in contempt or not, for instance? And what it would say is, well, we understand the security concerns, and this is the go-to phrase of the Israeli Supreme Court. The security concerns always trump everything.
And this
And
not only,
again,
it's not
yeah,
like something that happened in the 50s or 60s or 1948. I mean, it's last year when we went to the High Court to have the right of worship to go inside the church. This is what the court did. Exactly. They said freedom of worship must be respected. The police must collaborate with the Palestinians to go inside the church. But nothing. They kicked us out of the church. They beat us up, and they said there was only a recommendation, and they did not. So they continue when it comes to Palestinian. They only offer like an opinion, and usually their opinion is very liberal, as long as they make sure that it does not get implemented. So it's just I want to make this very clear to.
Yeah, and again, there many times when it comes to occupation laws, it's not liberal at all, right? The Supreme Court that everybody is saying what a great liberal institution, less than a year ago, gave the order that they can now evict Musafariata, right? The entire area, like that, and that has always been the case. Those have always been the rulings coming out of the Supreme Court. If we look at house demolitions, if we look at appropriations of land, if we look at settlement activity, that has always been legalized by the Supreme Court. So again, definitely not beyond the green line, but I think what's interesting again, and this is why I'm using the term liberal very liberally, is because on issues of, I mean, both of economic freedom, which is another form of liberal, which we can talk about the problems of that, but on issues of LGBTQ issues, feminist issues, those kinds of issues, it is pretty much on the liberal side. And again, so are other parts of the Israeli elite. And I think this is important because I'll give you an example from when the government was just elected. They didn't even have this reform. It wasn't on the table yet. One of the first laws that they said that they would be passing is a law that for the Americans in the room will sound extremely familiar. For everyone else, you're like, why should this even be a law? It's a very American discourse, which is a law that allows people not to provide services according to their religious beliefs. And again, in an American context, that's a very well-known law. And there's been a lot of debate about it. It's very foreign to Israeli politics and definitely for other countries. But when that came out, one of the interesting things that happened, and this is obviously like the first people who would be affected by this, usually by laws like this, at least the legislator's intent is LGBTQ people. That's kind of where it usually goes. And one of the first reactions was one of the biggest banks in Israel put out a statement saying, if this law passes, sure, it'll be someone's right not to do that, but we will not give them any financial services. Which is quite a statement, right? From a bank. And I think it's interesting because this is exactly that kind of moment where you see it's not just the Supreme Court versus the government. It's a traditional, both judicial, but also very economic elite in Israel that has been staying away from politics for a very long time. They don't care about the occupation, they don't talk about the occupation and a lot of other issues, but they have some issues that fit within that liberal ideology that are a red line for them. And I think if we're looking at what happened with this government now, is that this government, that's the line they crossed. They didn't cross a human rights line. They didn't even cross, I think, a line of concentration of power. I don't even think that that's what it was. It's that they crossed a line for that liberal elite. And it's important for me to say that it's an elite because this is where the conversation, I mean, if you're asking what is the justification, this is where the conversation becomes interesting. because a lot of the justification for the right is saying, look, there's an elite, an unelected elite in Israel that is controlling the country. And to a degree, they're right. The government controls a lot of things, but the economy is controlled, obviously, by non-elected people, like everywhere in the world, which is very significant. And we see the effects of that everywhere in the world. But that is a group of mostly white, mostly liberal, again, not left at all. When I say liberal in this context, it is not the left, but it is a set of some ideologies, which today in Israel politics, I would say is center, right? It's kind of the Yair Lapid and the Benny Gantz and that crowd. And they have a huge amount of power. And it's true. They have economic power. Again, they have academic power. And the majority of the country is voting on opposite politics. And that is where this government is getting its power for the reform, right? There have been huge protests, and I don't think there's a majority for this reform, and definitely people didn't vote for this reform. It wasn't on the ballot, but there is a representation of a bigger issue here. That is not, it's not made up, right? It sits on people's emotions, and it sits very much, again, I think the Israeli government and right have been using this and abusing this, but it also sits on discrimination within Israel. This elite that we're talking about is Ashkenazi, it's white. The majority of Likud voters are Mizrahi, are Jews from Arab countries. This is already a historical thing that's been going on for a very long time, of the kind of historical left, I can't even call them left, but labor and so on being extremely racist also on that aspect. And all of these things are playing into each other together. So I want to say it's a mess. There are a lot of people who are really, a lot of right-wing voters who really do feel emotionally, and we can break it down here and say how it's being used and so on, but they really do feel that they are second-class citizens. And many of them are second-class citizens. The critique needs to be, well, but the right-wing government is just as bad and just as white and just as elitist, and its policies are much worse also towards the working class within Israel, right? They're not the solution. But the fact that they're presenting themselves as a solution or as an alternative to that historical elite also does resonate. So I know I'm mixing everything up here, but I think it's important to kind of understand also where people are coming from. There's a question on the side as well.
Yeah, we will open it up. So please do write the questions in the chat. But we're trying to get, introduce the topic, and we'll offer opportunity for questions. So Lapid, I think either before for the new government or recently has continuously said that it is one of the things that he would oppose. I mean, we're in the anniversary or commemorating or of the Israeli the Jewishness, the state, the law. And he was one of the people who said that this needs to change. I mean, even like the people, I know that they're liberal, they're not left, but even like these voices would think that they would cherish the democratic values, at least within the borders for Israeli citizens. Do you think they were sincere or just trying to get Arab votes?
Well, I mean, democratic but Jewish, right? Like the reality is that Lapid, including his party, voted for the what was it called, the nation state. I mean, they support the concept of a Jewish state very, very clearly. They will say it's not discriminatory, but again, how can you have a state that belongs to a people without it being discriminatory? And they have their answers, right? But de facto, if you look at the policies, if you look at what they voted for, one of the recent votes was about the ability to take citizenship from people, including family members of people who are involved in terrorism. So while the Supreme Court said you can't do that, a lot of these parties were willing to vote for that. So it's hard to say, like, how can you position yourself and say, the democracy is extremely important for me and equality and everything, and then clearly vote in a way that is discriminatory to Palestinians? No Palestinian is going to be convinced by this. And that's what we see, right? Palestinian citizens of Israel are not joining these protests. And I understand why. And on the one hand, you say, of course, they have a political interest of this government, right-wing government, to fall. It is a terrible government. And of course, it is better to have a Supreme Court, and it is better to, what we have now is better than what this reform will do. But protesting for what we have now is a very difficult ask from Palestinians, including citizens of Israel, who are living under the oppression of this. Like, yeah, we don't want the worst thing, but we don't really want to be calling for what exists and has been existing and oppressing us for dozens of years either. So it's a very challenging place to be in.
Definitely. And I mean, I'm looking into the question, and we have very difficult questions, Sahar. So here's I'll start with the easiest, just 3 parts. Could you provide a brief history of the basic state laws? Who instituted them? What authority do these laws have? Why in 1948 did Israel not write a constitution?
Sure, all the questions. So the kind of common argument for why we don't have a constitution is that every time it was attempted, the issue of equality.
The UK also doesn't have a constitution, for example. They have a basic.
So I mean, they have common law. That's even worse. And they're just like, if we do something for long enough, it's apparently a constitution. But I mean, the history of it is partially that, right? Israel is a parliamentary system. It's not a presidential system. Constitutions are ingrained much more in presidential systems. Our legal system came from the British. It didn't need that in 48. Like, nobody was talking, should we do it? Should we not do it? There were some talks about it, but it wasn't as a fundamental thing. It was seen in many ways that the Declaration of Independence gives the energy of a constitution. But it did definitely come up quite a lot in history after that. And a lot of the argument that people have heard, I'm not a constitution or legal expert at all, but is around, it was very hard to agree on equality and on what equality means. Not only because of Palestinians, but also because of many of the Orthodox parties that were not willing to constitutionalize equality, including gender equality in that context. And it was seen as the alternative is building these basic laws. Basic laws are, I mean, the only thing that makes them different from other laws is that there's a statement that says this is a bit more serious, and therefore the Supreme Court can use it. And to change them, you need an actual majority as an absolute majority, as opposed to the majority of people sitting in the room. Okay, so you actually need more than 61 votes, as opposed to any other law that you can make changes in or whatever. If only 15 members of Knesset came in that day, it can be 10-5. That's the only difference, really, of a basic law. But the Supreme Court, not having a constitution, has been using them as the base, because they do have a bit more power than normal laws, quote unquote. So that's kind of their value. It's definitely nowhere close to a constitution and to the power a constitution could have. It's also why we can even be having this conversation. The law that says which governments have which authorities and stuff like that's all part of a basic law, which means it can be changed pretty easily, relatively.
Amazing, you're amazing, Sahar. Here's a very good question. Is it true that disempowering the Supreme Court leaves Israel open to the power of the International Criminal Court?
I love this question.
Yeah.
It's interesting because it's so much of the discourse, again, of this so-called liberal elite here, because they are panicking. Like, really, we have pilots saying we're not going to fly, and part of their arguments and why they're against this reform is now we can be sued internationally, which I don't know if they're willfully ignorant or it's a good argument for them. The reality is that yes, for international courts, criminal court, not the ICJ, the ICC is the one that's relevant here. You do like if you can show that there was due process within the country, then the international court is more likely to say, I'm not getting into this if there was due process, right? And the argument is, if we don't have a Supreme Court, we cannot say there is due process. And it's not only the Supreme Court, it's also one of the laws in these 140 is full impunity for soldiers during service, right? A law like that means that there will be no investigations within Israel. There isn't the ability of saying, look, we did an investigation, we found out everything is fine, and the international system won't be able to say, oh, well, they investigated. It might make it a bit easier. The international system can still say they investigated, we don't believe their investigation, and we're going ahead with an investigation of our own anyway. It's not a mechanism that's crucial. So yes, it might make it a bit easier, but it's really not as dramatic, I think, as they make it sound. I think for me, the interesting thing about this is that pilots in the Israeli Air Force had serious conversations with the head of the Air Force with that argument, which means that these are people who think that they can be sued in the International Criminal Court, right? Like that's an admission of, like, it's a complete admission of guilt in my eyes, and they don't see that, which for me is amazing, because again, this is like a group of relatively very well educated, in their own minds at least, liberal people who think that they did something that would amount to war crimes. I don't really know how to respond to that even, but that's part of what this argument is.
There's multiple more questions, but in light of the measures adopted by the right-wing government in Israel, can we argue that the veil of Israeli democracy is being pulled down, and this might have an impact on the views of the diasporic Jewish communities in the UK and the US specifically?
Inshallah. I mean, I think that's kind of the one thing that we can hope from what's happening. It's definitely creating a rift between, definitely between Jewish diaspora and Israel, between other governments. Like we are seeing statements coming out from governments on a political level that are pretty much saying, like, please don't do this because we're going to have to respond. Including, from the US, it looks, I was talking to a diplomat the other day who said, it feels like there's a babysitter from the Americans have to send babysitters to Israel, in the sense of like American diplomats need to come to the government and be like, guys, what do you do? Like, we can't protect this. So it's not only the Jewish diaspora community, but the international community as a whole. It is, if these laws pass, yes, we're probably going to see governments reacting to it. Also, definitely the Jewish diaspora community is in a different place. And again, we're also creating a rift internally with your own elite, right? With your own economic system. It's quite
just for a,
no, just saying, it's quite a daring thing.
For a reality check in most of the Arab world, we have corrupt governments and they don't respect human rights. Yet the US still defends the relationship with them and so on. So, it's in a way, it's a nice way to think about it. I wouldn't be that optimistic given our case studies with the different Arab regimes.
It's true, but again, the interests are different. The interests we know what the interest with Saudi is, right? The interests with Israel are a bit more complicated. They're not pure economic. They're economic, involved with politics, involved with internal US politics pretty heavily. And that makes it a more, I don't think they're going to cut relations, right, after this passes, but it definitely puts it in a much more challenging position, and definitely for the Europeans. For the Europeans, we've already heard governments saying, we don't know how much cooperation we can have with countries that don't share our value system. Now, again, they have all the cooperation in the world that they want. When they want to sell arms to Saudi, they do it. But it's a different relationship. It's a different kind of relationship. And it will affect, like, I have no doubt that there are things that would change if they do that, because they have to. I'm not saying they're going to completely boycott Israel. But it will definitely change relationships.
It will become more difficult to maintain the relationship, or it would require more energy to maintain, I think. So yesterday evening, I watched the film, The Future of Israel and Its Defenders on Vision TV. Have you seen it? Which is a very right TV channel. It was a film to celebrate 75 years for the independence of Israel. Has anyone else seen it? And is there a role for us this year? If yes, what is it? I don't know. It's have you seen the documentary?
I have not.
Okay, so every government needs to have a mechanism by which those in power are held to the laws passed. In the US, Israel, and all the rest, those in charge of the army should be disciplined for not obeying the court ruling on violence inside holy places, for example. Someone should go to prison for it. But to make a nation leader obey their own laws, especially if disobeying results in harm, would require a higher body, maybe an impartial world body, to have the will and the means to arrest, fine, or at least sanction the disobedient leaders. Any comments?
I mean, I think, and that's the tension, right? What do you do when a government doesn't do, like, when the government that holds the monopoly of power doesn't obey what it's told, right? Now, again, we don't, like, the cases that we see today are relatively pretty small, and the Supreme Court isn't even saying you didn't obey. They said, well, you maybe could maybe do something else. But some of what people are talking about now is what happens if they pass this reform. The Supreme Court say this reform is void. The government says the Supreme Court's decision is void. And then implementers, right, the police, need to decide not if they're going to storm Knesset and arrest anyone, because that's not going to happen. But they need to decide if a Supreme Court judge tells them to hold a member of government in contempt and therefore bring him in front of a court, do they go and do that, right? And their minister tells them, don't do it. And what's actually going to happen, and this is what a lot of people are talking about, is kind of, if it really comes to this clash, it means security forces themselves, and just because they are the ones who are forcefully implementing, are going to be in a position of choosing a side, which Israel doesn't know. Like, that's never happened in that way, right? They've never had to. And I think that that's a lot of where people are like, what would happen if that happens? And there's no answers to that, but
I think one last question. How have your studies in the UK contributed to your work? So you finished study, you did a master's degree in peace
yes.
studies?
I don't know how my studies themselves influenced, but I can tell you the people I studied with were from really all over the world, and doing a lot of amazing work in Kashmir and Colombia.
Arabs?
Yes, also Palestinians, a lot of Arabs from the entire region, anywhere from Yemen, Egypt, Syria, everywhere, and including Palestinians. It's a very international program. And I think, I mean, that was the main learning experience for me. It's also always a bit of a good reality check, right? I spent a month in Kashmir with one of my Kashmiri colleagues, and like, it's crazy there. Much crazier than where we're at on a daily basis, on a lot of different levels. The level of oppression, the level of surveillance, the level of everything, right? And on the one hand, it's kind of a reality check of remembering that I mean, I don't like remembering that other places are worse doesn't make this better, but it does, it is a reminder of how much more tools we have to work. The fact that I can sit here and have this conversation with you and talk about these things relatively freely could not happen if we were in Kashmir. But it means we have a responsibility in our ability to do that. And I think for me, that's a lot of kind of the reality check that I got this year. Other than that, if anyone's interested in militarism and climate and the contribution of militaries worldwide to the climate catastrophe, that's been my main research. So I've learned a lot about that, but I don't feel like that's a conversation we can start right now.
You are in Tel Aviv right now, but you're still located in Jerusalem, correct, Sahar?
Yes, I'm just here for the day for some meetings.
Yeah, today and tomorrow is a public holiday in Israel, correct?
It is a public holiday, yes. So we hide in our houses. It's what they call Independence Day. It's the day to commemorate, or the day to celebrate the 1948 war. Yes.
So, I mean, in Israel, it's big celebrations that this is, I mean, 75 years since the establishment of the State of Israel. And I mean, it's on the 15th of May, in the coming 10 days, actually, in the coming 20 days, it will be also the Palestinian date. The 15th of May is the Palestinian commemoration of the Nakba, 75 years. There are multiple events taking around the world that day in standing in solidarity with Palestinian refugees. And with that, it's an ongoing Nakba for us. So just an update, I'm curious about the discussions because the Israeli High Court was part of the discussions giving permits for the bereaved families. Were they granted the permits?
They were granted the permits. So for those who don't know, there's a annual ceremony for the day of the Memorial Day for Soldiers and Victims of Terror, in which a group called the Brief Family Circle do every year a joint Palestinian-Israeli memorial ceremony. And it's been going on for, I don't know, as long as I can remember. And every year there is a decision by the Ministry of Defense not to allow the Palestinians not to give permits to Palestinians, and every year the Supreme Court overrules that. And that happened again this year. It just got way more coverage because there's a whole issue around the Supreme Court. And I think maybe just so we end with a bit of optimism, this protest movement is not about the occupation at all, but it is politicizing people slightly. It is allowing a space to talk about this thing. And the ceremony yesterday was probably one of the biggest ones, the joint Israeli-Palestinian one, because it got so much coverage. Last week, a very, very famous Israeli songwriter passed away, and his daughter gave the eulogy with a shirt that said, "There is no democracy with occupation," which is a shirt that's coming out of this, the more radical sides that are joining these protest movements. And it was a huge deal. Obviously, a lot of criticism, but the next week after that, the protest after that, everyone came to the occupation block to ask for those shirts. And like, there is an opening here. And there are currently there are occupation blocks, what we call kind of anti-occupation blocks in the big protests in 15 different cities. And that's growing all the time, and their reach is growing. And we do have a moment, it's definitely not representing this protest movement, but we have a moment as kind of the more radical left to bring up this conversation and to get more people involved. And so I think it's an extremely important window for us, even though it means, standing next to people protesting with millions of Israeli flags every week, but it has its advantages as well.
And I mean, there's two ways to look at it: either a cup or a glass of water half empty or half full. And congratulations, Sahar, you see it half full. I would like us all to echo Sahar and to be very much optimistic. We will need to be naive, maybe, but passionate. because this is what real change takes. It takes foolish people to be naive and just to think of the best. Thank you so much, Sahar. You're an amazing person. And for how long did you stay in the UK?
A year and a half or 15 months.
So
not that long.
yeah, so you did not lose your spirit despite the bad weather in the UK. So thank you so much, Sahar, for your commitment, for your work, and for just being a very kind and nice person.
Thank you for having me. And it's
Yes,
good to
thank you.
see some familiar faces.
Next week, we're inviting the family of Shireen Abu Aqli to be with us. So they will give you an update about the situation and about journalism in general, what's happening in Palestine, Israel, when it comes to journalism, but also to an update on the case of Shireen Abu Aqli. And we're also having other Palestinian journalists joining us. So next week is another special event. Thank you, Sahar. See you all next week. Appreciate your commitment. Take care, friends.